Angiosperms. Angiosperms constitute highly advanced plants which dominate the present vegetation. As the name indicates, in angiosperms, the ovules and seeds are enclosed in a sac-like structure called ovary, fruit, angio, sac, sperma means seed. The angiosperm.
As with all land plants, the life cycle of an angiosperm alternates between a diploid sporophyte generation, represented here by the flower of the mature sporophyte plant, and a haploid gametophyte generation. Within the flower's male parts, called the anthers, are millions of diploid spores called microsporocytes. These microsporocytes divide by meiosis to produce haploid microspores. Meanwhile, a similar process occurs within the flower's female parts, which consist of one or more carpels. In this example, the single carpel consists of a stigma, style, ovary, and ovule. A single diploid megasporocyte exists in the ovule and divides by meiosis to produce 4 haploid megaspores, only one of which survives. By producing 2 different types of spores, the microspores and megaspores, angiosperms and all other seed plants are considered heterosporous. Each microspore undergoes a mitotic division and differentiation to produce a pollen grain. A pollen grain is the haploid male gametophyte called a microgametophyte. The surviving megaspore divides by mitosis to produce 7 haploid cells. One large, centrally located cell contains 2 nuclei called polar nuclei. Another cell is the egg. The 7-celled structure makes up the female gametophyte called the megagametophyte. The pollen grain pollinates the female parts of the flower by landing on the stigma. Here, the pollen grain germinates and a pollen tube grows down the style until it meets the female gametophyte. 2 sperm from the pollen grain travel through the pollen tube and enter the female gametophyte. One fertilizes the egg, forming a diploid zygote. The other fertilizes 2 polar nuclei, forming a triploid cell. The fertilization of both the egg cell and the central cell is called double fertilization, a hallmark of the life cycle of angiosperms. The zygote, which begins the next sporophyte generation, develops into the embryo, while the triploid cell develops into the nutritive endosperm of the seed. The seed germinates, and when the sporophyte matures, the life cycle begins again.
Hello students, this is non-flowering plants, and nevertheless we're going to cover the angiosperm life cycle, the flowering plant life cycle. So let's go for the overview here. We have seeds. Now the seeds in angiosperms are a little bit special. In addition to the embryo, we have another tissue outside of the embryo called the endosperm, which is made by the confluence of male and female contributions from the mother and the father, but it's not part of the embryo. That is inside of the seed. Seeds are dispersed as usual. They grow up to be sporophytes, and then they make flowers. The flowers have some special structures that we'll get into. One of those special structures is the carpel, and that is a structure that encloses the ovules and then ultimately the seeds. So we have ovules there. Then the same flower or other flowers makes pollen grains, and then pollen grains during pollination are transferred to the carpels, usually of a different flower when they're successful. Then the pollen grains germinate, they grow pollen tubes, and fertilization proceeds, both fertilization that makes the embryo and fertilization that makes the endosperm. So let's go into it in more detail. Here we start with a seed. That seed disperses, and it makes a little seedling. That seedling then grows up to make a sporophyte. and that sporophyte then would have flowers. Now the flowers could be big showy flowers, or they could be flowers that are pollinated by the wind. For instance, grasses are flowering plants, and they have flowers. Nut trees are flowering plants, and they have flowers, but those flowers are kind of small, whereas tulips have flowers, and tulips have larger flowers. For many flowering plants, the flowers have 4 whorls of structures. The outer whorl is a whorl of sepals, and then there's a whorl of petals. The next whorl in is the male whorl, and it consists of a series of stamens. And then the central whorl is a whorl of carpels. The carpels will have ovules inside of them. Here's a blow-up of an ovule. It has 2 integuments on the outside, then there's a nucellus, and there's, of course, a micropyle, but there's no pollination drop in these things. Then in the center, there's a megasporocyte, and that megasporocyte undergoes meiosis and makes 4 megaspores. 3 of those megaspores wither, and that leaves 1 functional megaspore. That functional megaspore undergoes a few mitotic divisions, and it makes a female gametophyte, a megagametophyte. And that megagametophyte we call an embryo sac. So in this case that's diagrammed, we have an embryo sac that consists of 3 antipodal cells, an endosperm mother cell that has 2 nuclei called polar nuclei, an egg, and then a synergid cell on either side of the egg. That's the megagametophyte or embryo sac. Okay, let's go back and look at the male structures. So we have stamens. At the top of stamens are anthers. Those anthers have a series of microsporangia, 4 in this case. The microsporangia contain within them microsporocytes. The microsporocytes undergo meiosis and make microspores. Those microspores then will divide a couple times and make pollen grains. So pollen grains are microgametophytes. Those pollen grains will consist of a couple of cells that you can see, a generative cell and a tube cell. You can usually see both of those. And then those pollen grains will be dispersed during pollination. Pollination could happen by insects or by hummingbirds or by bats or by wind. Lots of different types of pollination. Pollination is the movement of pollen grains from the stamens that produce them to stigmas, often of flowers of a different plant. And then the pollen grains germinate and they grow a pollen tube. That pollen tube will have 2 sperm nuclei inside of it. It will then get to the egg and fertilize the egg, and that makes a zygote. And then the other sperm nucleus, in this case, fuses with the polar nuclei of the endosperm mother cell to make endosperm. In this case, endosperm is a triploid tissue. It's nutritive. It grows around the embryo. In other flowering plants, the endosperm could be of a different ploidy. So we end up with an immature seed that then matures. It's inside of an immature fruit that then matures. Inside of the seed coat, we have endosperm. And then inside of that, we have an embryo. So I've made this little poem for you. The poem reads, eggs plus sperm make zygotes that grow up to be embryos. Polar nuclei plus the other sperm nucleus grow up to be endosperm. Ovules plus sperm result in immature seeds that grow up to be seeds. And then the carpel, after fertilization, is an immature fruit, which grows up to be a fruit. And a fruit can be something that is dispersed by birds and it's fleshy, or it can be something that has wings and disperses the seeds that way, or it could be something that opens up and releases the seeds, and then the seeds disperse, but the carpel wall, the fruit, remains on the mother plant. And that's all that I have to say about that.